Pause. All right.
Now it doesn't want to give me an option. Dion, it doesn't want us to record the meeting.
Someone in the group must just check this. So I don't know. Sometimes it's not the
that it's already recording.
Okay, now, okay, sorry. Now, your thing that I saw, not mine. So it's recording. Sorry, I saw your. Okay, perfect. It's recording. Thank you.
So what I've done is I've actually completed the analysis, Zwanga, of your study. So what I want to do is I want to actually go through the results of your study and the thinking behind the processes of how I got to the final step. So in this, there's a number of steps, interlinking steps that we go through from an analysis perspective. And you will see that as we go through this, the contribution, the real contribution of addressing the research objectives only comes at the latter part of the analysis. And when you do your write-up, there's a section or there's a part that you will do your write-up that hasn't got to do with addressing the actual aspects of your research objectives. It's about telling the reader how did you get to the measurements that you are using. And that's an important facet of the write-up. When we do master's degree, we sometimes skip some of these. So there's a lot more assumptions that we adopt that is okay for a master's degree. But when we move on to a PhD, the scientific community kinds of expect us to show more detail because we are more in a contribution phase. So there must be a real scientific contribution when we do our PhD. All right, so how do I typically start with the analysis? Is your title gives us an indication of what you are busy with. Now, this title says the impact of digital signage on shoppers' perception of mall atmospherics. Is this going to stay the same? Therese, are we going to go with this title?
Prof, you are on mute in case you're speaking.
Therese, can you hear me?
Sorry, Dion. No, this was just a working title because we're not measuring mall atmospheres. I think it was based on an abstract. So I think she must suggest another title.
All right.
Because
so
we
the
are
main
measuring
thing,
experience and not mall atmospherics.
Yeah. And the one thing that I'm always trying to convey is this word of impact. So while it might not be in your title, be very careful when we come to the statistics to insinuate that whatever is on the left has got an impact on what is on the right. So we need to be cautious and conscious in terms of the wording that we use. I think we've had an article many moons ago, Therese, where they've highlighted where we've used this word. And I think we are still guilty, some of our students, of kind of using the word impact, you know, just in a kind of a free sense. And we're not conscious about what does it mean. So this was one of the articles, or one of the critique that was mentioned from the editors, where they said when we do cross-sectional research, and all of you are doing cross-sectional research, that means that you've got a questionnaire that you sent out to a group of people, a target population, or hand it out, and it's being completed in a specific point in time. Even if it is covering, say, a month of data collection, but it is covering not a longitudinal sense of data collection. And then it's very difficult to make an argument that we can really measure impact or an effect. So when you do your write-up, just have a look. It's about the variation in your independent variables, explaining the variation in your dependent variable. But on a theoretical level, so when you go back to the theory, the results can support or reject the impact aspect that's argued from a theoretical sense, but not from a data sense. Let me just quickly put this off. So just be careful when we get to the write-up and just be conscious about it. I will share this article with you that you can just read it, what was the critique. All right, so the first view is this. Now, where does this come from? This is a theoretical or a theory-driven research model that you have come up with. And I think we've used this in some way, and so for some of you, it might be very similar. So, Fisu, you said that you will adapt yours a little bit, that things on the left will be different, and that's okay, but we, yeah?
Yes, Dr. Van Zyl, sorry, once you get me, while I'm here, sorry to disturb you, can you take just 1 minute just to take me through that impact and effect and influence? I heard the reviewers, I will read the comments, but in just few words.
All right. So I've highlighted the sentences that I think are important. So they make the following argument. They say decisions made during research design process ultimately impact the degree of confidence readers can place in the conclusion. So remember, you have got a model that you propose, a theoretical model, and what you are doing is you are collecting data to argue the case for this model. So you want to know, are there evidence in the data to support this model? I always say that, can you prove a theory? Can you say that a theory is correct? We cannot really, because it's just a theory. But what we can do is we can find evidence in data to say that we support the theory. And through multiple research projects over years, we continuously try to prove or to support that theory. So all that we are doing in all our analysis that will follow is this. But in here, we are suggesting that these things are driving these from a theoretical perspective, which ultimately has got an effect on this. This is the theoretical. But remember, there's a time sequence to this. So this is also time bound. So if we experience whatever we are measuring this, as for instance, that there's an entertainment value, so we first need to experience entertainment value, and only after we've experienced it, then we will experience the user side of it, which might say either the intent to use it again, or whatever we've got on this side. So this is what the design, so the design is driving our arguments, is driving our research objectives. So this is what it says. Decisions made during the research design process ultimately impact the degree of confidence. So whatever we write, the research or the examiner will say, but can I trust the results that you are giving me? But if your design is such and you're making conclusions about causality, but it was not covered in your research design, then it means it falls flat. And it says, hang on, while you have got a great research design and you say that you've used a survey and a questionnaire and it was cross-sectional, it doesn't support the arguments or the research objectives that you are proposing, because your research objective says there's an impact, and this is not what you have measured. You have merely measured the correlation between a set of measures and the results or the variation in another set. And now it goes on.
Usually, for the impact is, I think what Jan also saying, for impact you must measure before and after. So that's when you use an experimental design, and that's not what what we did. We just cross-sectional, just measured it once.
And now we use cross-sectional data, and this is what happens. And now they come, either the examiners or when you write an article, and they say, great, but the two does not speak to one another. So your research design does not speak to your objectives. And then it says, this rejection, when we send a journal or when we send it to the examiners, and they say, no, we're not accepting the research, does not happen because such data are inherently flawed. You've still used a research design that got you valid data, but it's about the decisions that you make. It happens because, and this is the crux of it, many, perhaps most research questions in management implicitly, even if not framed as such, address issues of change. So what we are saying is that if we can control these things on the left-hand side, because that's ultimately that you want to do, is you want to make recommendations to say, guys, if we can change these things on the left-hand side, through marketing programs, through interventions, through communication, whatever the case might be, we will ultimately have an effect on what is happening on this side. So implicitly, we are suggesting change based on what is happening on the left. So we also assume that we can alter this, because this, in a sense, is going back to the theory of planned behavior. It says whatever is on the left-hand side, if we change this, it will result or cause these things on the right-hand side. And now we start writing it up as such. And in that, we suddenly have got a problem. The problem with cross-sectional data is that they are mismatched with research questions that implicitly or explicitly deal with causality or change. So when you suggest impact or effect, just be cautious that it's from a theoretical level, but we didn't do it on a data or an analytical process. And then exactly what Prof now said. Researchers simply cannot develop strong causal attributions with cross-sectional data, nor can they establish change regardless of which analytical tools they use. So even structural equation modeling or path analysis suggest that we are measuring an effect. It cannot happen from a cross-sectional perspective. Instead, longitudinal panel or experimental data are needed to make inferences about change. So think about your write-up. Where can you address this issue from the start? In your chapter 1, when you talk about your delimitations, it means the scope of your research and your assumptions. This is an easy way and an already starting point for the reader to say, all right, this researcher takes cognizance of the fact that in his research design using cross-sectional data, and while he might suggest causality, it is not because of the data analysis, it's from a theoretical perspective. So what you are doing is you're already telling the reader, this is my design and this is my scope. I'm not suggesting causality from a data analysis perspective. Can you see how you can almost want to say jump the gun, but level the playing field when you do your write-up? So while I'm concerned about the data analysis, it's not the data analysis that are sometimes flawed, it's the way that you present it. Does it make sense, guys, girls? So it's about how you address your write-up that will make the biggest difference. And I think if I look back at how some of you progress with your masters and the success that Prof has had with his students, when I pinpoint it, I'm telling you it's more about the way that they do the write-up than the actual analysis. Because then you are meeting the three things. The axiology, that's the ethics part, and in ethics, there's also a sense of, because my students get slammed sometimes here at UNISA, because the ethics said that if you've got a certain research design, but you're reporting it wrongly, there's an ethical issue with it. So you're making conclusions that are not there. It's not supported by the analytics. The other thing is your ontology, that's your contribution. So if there's a mismatch between your research design and the way that you present it, except for ethics, you're not contributing. And the other thing is the epistemology. That's your processes that you are following to produce the knowledge. So if you are following a process of cross-sectional data, but you are constantly saying that the data and the results are suggesting or are saying causality, there's a flaw in it. So keep to that space. So Fisu, is it making sense?
Yes, thank you very much. I just got 1 out of 2 answers I'm looking for. I know the first one, that I cannot use the impact in the cross-sectional. I just want to know
what's the other one?
Yes, it's like you did mention it, like the cause of the causality. But I wanted to talk about the effect of or the influence. But I think you can continue with the structural. You explained enough on this one.
All right.
Yes, I think let's continue because Paulin has to leave just after 9. He's working. Yeah. So if you have a specific question, you can email, or we can deal with it a bit later. Just some background is all of you will be able to relate with this because Zwanga used the use and gratification theory. You will use it in a different context, Paulin, and then you are preferring to use it, Sifiso. So you'll recognize that.
All right. So what we are doing with the analysis, and this is an important perspective, we are constantly working towards looking at the evidence in the data given the model or given the theory. So keep it in mind that you've got a deductive approach. All of you have got a deductive approach. That means that you started off with a research problem. You said, but how can I address this research problem or this gap? And you made the decision that it can be answered quantitatively. So your quantitative approach lines up with your deductive kind of generation of theory, because your deductiveness speaks to theory or knowledge generation. And in there, it's linked to your philosophy. So it's about the evidence in the data to support the theory that was given to you because you started off with a literature review. So it's not about the evidence in the context of the theory given the data. Remember that this is the context that we speak to. All right, now we come to some basics. So when I start off with my analysis, and this is your flat file, your SPSS data file, and it differs between the way that we collect data. So because most of you have used a certain design or a way of collecting this, and this was in a particular sense different from an online version. This was collected on-site directly from respondents. Am I correct?
Yes, so this was collected in 2 malls.
So this constitutes actual field work. So Zwanga, when you do your write-up of your methodology chapter, which you might want to revise, it must come from the perspective of actually being on site. And there's different elements to establishing the quality of the data. You remember there's a whole data quality or a fieldwork plan. You know, how did you collect your data? What happened in field with your supervision? Because all of these things speak to the quality of your data and the reliability and, in a sense, the validity. But it's about, can we have a valid data set? And in that, if you have found in field that you've got missing values, I'm now reflecting on that part to say, if I scan the data, and while it might sound trivial, it's part of your write-up. It establishes a rigor of your design with your examiners. So if you don't put it in, or if you just quickly went through it, there can be questions. You say, hang on, remember your quantitative approach speaks to replicability. So one of the elements of quantitative research is that your research must be replicable. It must be that someone else must do the same and get to the same answers. That's your reliability element. So if I look at this and I find missing values, then I'm going to ask, but what happened in field? Why are they missing values? What happened to the quality control within the fieldwork? So in addressing this, there's an element that when you do your write-up and you speak to data collection, there's already aspects that will satisfy the examiners to say, yes, there was quality control. You know, when there were missing values, the respondents were made aware of it and said, can you please answer? Remember, there's no right or wrong answers, all of those things. And then there's another sentence or 2 sentences that will come up when you talk about the data analysis, to say the first step in the data analysis was to assess for missing values. And we found that none of the cases showed missing values. So it's kind of a tick mark that you make. It might take a paragraph, but that's what's building your PhD. Then we're also looking for unengaged responses. This is less likely when we do actual field work. Unengaged responses come in when we ask respondents, and all that they say is, I agree, I agree, I agree, I agree, I agree, I agree, and they never have variation in their data. So how do I counter for this? Is I quickly run a standard deviation. So remember, these are raw values. I calculate a standard deviation across all of these cases or all of these items, and I look at the standard deviation. And if there's a standard deviation of 0, what does a standard deviation of 0 mean? It means that there's no variation. The respondent just gave one answer continuously. Then I say, hang on, this respondent might have not engaged with the questionnaire. But that should have been picked up by your interviewers. So while they can complete the interview, they would have afterwards, not to say it in front of the respondent, but maybe afterwards said, hang on, we can't use this questionnaire. So it is less likely to find a scenario of unengaged responses when we deal with actual field work. And that can be mentioned as an advantage. Remember, you constantly try to argue the case for rigor of your data, rigor of your design, and quality of your data. So use the opportunity to say, it differs from when we do online research. The advantage of fieldwork is that it can cover these things already in field. So if you look at this, I did not find any of these where we see strong evidence for that they just mentioned one. And this is also an assumption when you look at your data collection, is you're assuming that there should be variation in your data. So it's already answering that question as well. So 2 analysis that I've quickly done is missing values and unengaged responses, which means at the end, you can say in a sentence that we have now got 450 valid questionnaires that can be used for data analysis. So again, it satisfies the research definition, meaning that it's a systematic process. So you're adhering to this, you're building the argument that the first step was to do this, we satisfied these conditions, therefore we are sitting with 450 valid questionnaires that we can continue with for data analysis. All right, what's the next step? Is in your results chapter is to describe your sample profile. Now this is an important aspect because this is where you start building an argument for representativeness or not. So it's about what you say, to what extent do these sample profile meet the target population that you had in mind. Because later on, if you start making conclusions about the results, it's in the context of your sample and to some extent a bigger population. So this, for instance, meets the assumptions of your quota sampling. And now the question comes in, why did you do 200 in Gateway and 250 at Tiger Valley? There might be a very basic rationale for it, that your Tiger Valley is a bigger shopping center than Gateway, or it might be about resources. But we need to answer at some stage the question of, but are there 2 populations at play? And this is an important argument that we need to make. So is there invariance between the people that we've asked in Gateway versus Tiger Valley? It's not only about if they constitute differences in their answers. So listen carefully to what I'm saying. It's not only about to what extent did they measure on these elements. Invariance says, but does this research model apply as a theory to both these groups? Those at Tiger Valley and those at Gateway. So that's an important assumption or argument that we must make. Can we assume that this theory would apply equally to both of these groups? Because they might constitute different populations, which means they might warrant different research models.
So Dion, that's in this case, we know that it will get there, but I just want to explain, for example, let's say you do 2 different social media platforms, or Poland, if you do 2 different countries, it might be that you'll do 2 different models.
Very important.
Yes. So how am I going to explain that? I mean, in my specific case, I wouldn't like to use 2 different models.
We'll get to the variance now, which Dion will explain. Your variance will tell you. It's a stats test that will tell you whether we use 2 or 1. It's going to explain to you now.
Okay.
So there's 2 parts to answering this. The first part is your literature. Remember, the literature or the theoretical assumptions that you make is always important in terms of how did you come up with this research model. There must be some past evidence that this model is fairly stable across a wide range of different populations. So if you just go back to your literature review and you look at all the research studies that were done in the past across different populations where this model applied, or parts of this, is already the first evidence that we assume that your selection of the research model should apply to these different populations. So my plea is, don't just wait for these statistics, because we're going to run into a problem, you will see. Don't just wait for the statistics, because at the end, the literature, in a sense, can precede our arguments later on, or refute these statistics later on. It's a very important argument that you start off to say, but in your research design, when you selected these, you already had the assumption that this research model should apply to both of these groups. The same with, if you look at it from that perspective, even from a gender perspective. So remember, it's as equal, not only from a mall or a site, it's also if this applies for gender, and if it applies for age, and if it applies for home language. Does it make sense, Pauline? You need to argue it from all cases, because the question is, why were you interested in, for instance, differences later on between males and females? It's a theoretical question. We want to contribute to knowledge, to say, guys, when we get to this research model, there might be differences between males and females, not in terms of the constructs, but in terms of the extent of measurement. But at the end, the theoretical model must be satisfied. So there's already an argument. And then later on, it comes to, from a statistical perspective, the stats. And go and read up on invariance. What does variance tell us? What does the word variance tell us? Variance tells us that there are differences. Not everyone measures the same. We can see variation in the data. But when we talk about invariance, we say that this model applies equally in our understanding of the behavior of our sample and our population across different groups, independent groups. So that is what we say is invariant. And there's different levels of invariance. And invariance is especially important when we develop questionnaires, which you're not in that space. So we're going to deal with invariance either only from an assumption perspective or from an assumption and a statistical perspective. Zwanga's research shows a little bit of difficulty in this, and we'll get to this. All right, so whatever you want to do from a sample profile, this is straightforward, and it's also about telling the respondent or the readers, the examiners, of where we find differences. So for instance, in Gateway, do we see differences in terms of their usage or their visit? Do we see differences in terms of their gender profile? You need to ask yourself, what is important to report to the examiners or to the scientific community? What can make a difference in our understanding of the results? Because if we're going to find invariance, then we're going to pool the data together. That pool meaning we throw everything together and we look at it from a total sample perspective, 450. So whatever analysis we do from a confirmatory factor analysis or a structural equation or a path analysis, we're not going to do two sets of results. We're going to do one set, because we assume that they are, in a sense, homogeneous. So statistics-wise, it's also to argue that their profiles are the same. Can you see where you have got these pockets of evidence that you need to report in order to support our assumption of invariance? So it's a theoretical aspect, a literature aspect, it's a statistical aspect, starting with your sample profile, that they behave or they assume to be the same profile. And here and there I can see they match fairly well. Now what does that mean? They don't match exactly. That's also not the understanding. It's impossible to have an exact replica of the type of response that we asked in the one side versus the other. All right. So this covers your sample profile. The next aspect, and you can see, is so the way that I present my analysis is also in a sense how you will present your results in your chapters, starting off with your methodology chapter and then going on to your results chapter. All right, item descriptors. Here we look at it from a construct perspective. So what am I interested in? This might not be something to report straight off, but it's always a good idea to give the reader a sense of the variation in the items, meaning we are now moving towards the constructs that we are interested to measure. Remember in your questionnaire, or when we started off, we were interested in these constructs, convenient information, benefits, but we had the limitation from a theoretical perspective and from a research that we cannot measure, for instance, affordance by just asking them one question. It's a latent construct. That's why we've got it in this circle. It says that it's this hypothetical construct where we can attach a theoretical definition to it, meaning in this model, we can say that higher levels of affordance will explain user experience in a certain way. So what did the theory say? Higher levels of affordance will give us a more positive user experience. So that little plus that you can put in there, and the line that says this one is linked to this one, is from a theoretical level. And there's a definition to affordance, a theoretical definition. And now that we come up with our empirical side, there's now an operational definition to affordance. And you made the whole argument that if we want to measure this hypothetical construct, there are certain things that we can do. We can ask respondents to say, for instance, to what extent do they agree with items or statements related to affordance. So the theory says the fact that they agree strongly is the outcome of this construct being there, affordance. Not the items or the answers to the items is giving rise to affordance. That way, that's a formative assessment. We're doing a reflective assessment. So all the answers of our items in our questionnaire that deals, for instance, with this construct. So if I go to the fact that this person said he strongly disagrees, is the outcome of this construct being there, evident, confident, convenient information, and the same for all. But now we come to a point where we say, but we need to move towards assessing if these 8 items can represent a suitable sample of all possible statements or items that can measure this construct. So we are moving from observed data. You agree that this is observed data because we've got actually measures for these. While it is perception or opinion based, we observed it from the respondents. By asking them the statement, they gave us an answer. They gave us quantitative data back. They said, on a scale of 1 to 5, I rate this as 1, which means strongly disagree. So these things in my database are observed data. But we want to move from observed data to a latent variable, which is also observed. So I want to get at the end, I want to get to a variable at the back of my database, where I've got an actual measure for this thing that we call CI, or whatever the variable is. So all of my analysis are now going to turn towards showing that these items are valid and reliable, and that this value here at the end of the database is going to be representative of this construct that we call CI or benefit or whatever the case might be. So all of this effort is just to show that I've got 5 variables that I can now use to produce knowledge. And this is where we are aiming to go towards. And when we look at these item analysis, it's about assessing things like the average. Because I want to know, can these data or these averages constitute the building blocks for getting a variable which measures CI? Very basic is I could have just taken the average of the averages. This could have given me already a proxy variable. And here's the average is 5.32. But I can't just take the averages. I must also see if they hang together on a relationship basis. So if someone said he disagrees with this, what are the chances that he then also disagrees with this item? Because remember, this is a sample of all possible statements that represent that construct. So I can't just go and make the argument that these items on average, that's what we call a formative index. I just form the index by just adding these. We will get there, but first I must make some arguments that they are also linked on a variation platform, on a variation basis. And part of it, I must also make sure that there are variation in the data. So I look at a couple of things. I see, do they form the basis of a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 7? What does the averages tell me in terms of this construct? So if I look at this 5, how do I interpret this? What can I say about these items? I use digital signage because it saves my time. Do they agree with this statement or do they disagree with this statement? Zwanga, it's your research. What does an average of 5.73 tell me about agreement with this statement?
I think they do agree.
All right. Why do you say this? Because it is relative to the scale that we have used. So, yes, so the scale was from, yeah.
So if it's on 5, then it's leaning towards agreement. If it's on 1, then it's leaning towards disagreement.
All right. So you can already make some judgment, empirical judgment, in terms of what you sense or what you see on an item level. And I can get a sense, you know, with which items do they agree more, but I can't say that it is statistically different because I haven't done any hypothesis test. And now it's about your writing style. So you can either start reporting these kind of item analysis in a section that starts, or you can first deal with the construct level and then only afterwards start talking about the overall construct that we've got. And Therese, I think you can also guide here what would be a suitable approach when we deal with the chapters and the headings. Do you think that the recommendation is that they already start talking about the items and the results there? What is your feeling?
Dion, I actually want to ask you about that, is because the problem is also, yes, because we've got the factor analysis, and now you can either assume that's in the factor that was based on the existing instrument, or you do the factor analysis. So what I do is to overcome it. What we look at the we put the average in there, and we discuss the average. So we kind of do both on the item level as well as on the construct level.
I think that's a good suggestion, Zwanga. So all of you, so it's about the sequence of presenting the results, that it makes sense in terms of the story that we tell. So I think this part for me, yeah.
Because Dion, the alternative is not done now. That is to do factor analysis, and then you confirm with what are the factors. But that is actually, that's what I say. Yeah. So I just don't spend too much time here. It's also, it's just to warm up and make it interesting. So you present it kind of as if it's a business. You was presenting to people from the industry or whatever. So it's not too statistical. It's just that people can understand that you'd understand the difference between standard deviation and average and that type of thing.
Yeah. My suggestion is that we don't report this straight up. We wait for the factor analysis, because in the factor analysis, we anyway report means. Yeah. But what this allowed me to, and remember, you guys are not only here for your specific PhD, right? You're also preparing when you will be supervising. What I use this for is to quickly look at the items and the ratio for the kurtosis. Kurtosis is about the variation in your, it's about the peakedness. And I found with some students that when we look at the items, they don't show a lot of variation. It means that everyone just agreed with that statement, or they strongly agreed. And as soon as we don't find any variation, it means they will fall out, or they will present problems when we go on to your factor analysis, or they will have problems in your confirmatory effect analysis. So for me, this was just a quick check. And all that I've done is I've looked at the ratio between my statistic and my standard error. Remember, with a normal distribution.
Just explain this slowly, because you've explained it to me, but just what you look at and what are the cutoffs, so that everybody's on the same page. This is very important.
Right. Let me quickly take you back to Stats 101. You remember the normal distribution? This normal distribution. Can you see it on my screen? So what we say is, if we take measures from a sample and we start plotting the data, in the middle we get our mean, and then if we calculate certain statistics, typically if we've got a normal distribution, about 68% of the data will fall within one standard deviation to the left and to the right of your mean. If we take two standard deviations to the left and to the right, it's actually a little bit more, 1.96. We find that there are 95% of the data falls within two standard deviation of the mean. If we take three standard deviation, it covers about 99%. So using this principle of one standard deviation, two standard deviation, three standard deviations, we can get a sense of the variation in our data. Now, if we've got data that are very peaked, and we look at kurtosis. So here's a typical example of kurtosis. This one, which is very peaked, got a very small kurtosis, but it's got a big tail. Can you see? So we sit with a lot of data on the sides. And if I use this principle and I take my value, my kurtosis, which is almost like an average, but it's a kurtosis value, and the value of 0 would tell me that it's normally distributed. And I take the standard error, which is a measure of my standard deviation, and I get the ratio of these two. Anything that's got a value above 3, because remember, I'm coming back to this, your standard, your normal distribution. So where this ratio of your standard deviation relative to the value is more than 3, it shows problems with normality, and that can pose problems later on. And what I've done is I've actually not even taken a value of 3, I've taken a value of 10 as my norm. So I really want to look at the extreme items that show extreme elements of kurtosis. And here's, for instance, one. I use digital signage to avoid loneliness. So here, this value shows relative low standard deviation, but high kurtosis relevant to my standard error. So now I need to actually go and have a look at ENT1. So let's quickly just do a graph of ENT1, and let's just assess it visually in terms of the variation. And let's see what comes out. So there's your distribution. Now the question is, we've got 50% of the respondents that said strongly disagree. I was expecting that there should be more people that shows variation. There should be more variance in this data set, because if everyone just said strongly agree, when we do confirmatory factor analysis or exploratory factor analysis, this might be problematic, because if there's no variation, we can't use it for exploratory factor analysis. What is the underlying assumptions of exploratory factor analysis? We're looking for the correlation between items to say, but they form a single construct. So now I'm looking at this, but if you assess this, do you think that this is highly problematic? What is your sense? You must have some kind of gut.
If you're talking, are you referring to a practical interpretation?
Practical interpretation?
No, so I think that when we looked at the instrument, because it's an assessment instrument and use and gratification, part of that is avoid loneliness, but we immediately thought that this is nonsense. There's no ways. You can use some media such as TV to help you with your loneliness or boredness, but digital science is not that. So it makes sense from a practical perspective that I will say, no, I don't use it for avoid loneliness.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, when I also saw the question, I was asking myself, how does loneliness, play any role there? But I think in general, for most of our studies where we have a good idea of what's going on and what could be motivations and so forth, we know that for certain questions, we can expect to have, a lot of extreme answers, like you said, either people strongly disagree or disagree, or either people strongly agree and disagree. So for a lot of my questions, I don't expect a lot of variance. I can already expect extreme answers, either on the agree side or on the disagree side.
There's two things that's important to remember here. The statistics that we do is driven by variation. If we expect an item to show no variation, there's very little that we can do statistically with it. So if everyone just disagrees with it, we cannot do anything. We cannot do correlation. We can't do group differences, because all that it will say, it's like a control variable. It's like asking people the question, do you use digital media or digital signage? If these people have not experienced it before, then we need to ask, but is it a relevant item? So there's two things that...
let me explain, and I think you know it all. This is about the big debate is whether you follow the micro or the macro approach. So it's like, for example, if you use the use and gratification scale, which was not adopted, the same that a lot of our theories, we don't adopt it. So we test whether it can be applied in a different media context. So for the same with brand personality. So the alternative is to develop a scale. Or so what we're actually saying here is that on a theoretical level is that this element does not apply. People don't use it, although they might use it for other media. So that's why we did not change it, because we're trying to go back to the theory and say that not all the dimensions are applicable to digital signage.
Yes. So the outcome can be two things. Either later on this item might not feature in our model anymore because it doesn't show variation, and there's a very good theoretical or context rationale for it. But statistically, for the time being, I'm keeping it in. So I'm not making a decision now. Yeah. So statistically, I could have said, shoot, you know what, this doesn't show. And listening to your arguments, I can say, all right, guys, let's make a decision and then throw this out from the start. But this still tells me that there are some variation, that let's first, just for the benefit of the doubt, keep this in.
It makes the process more sound, 100%.
Yeah. So what I'm also assessing through this is that I think you've fairly hit the mark in terms of your items. I've seen some students where some of these come out as 32 or even 50, which means they included items or statements in their research where they should have actually excluded. It should have come out already with their pilot study to say, but guys, people just say they all agree with this statement. it means it's not relevant for the questions, or there's a context, or it's about the population. So if we need to answer anything later on about validity or reliability, content validity, we can say that these support us. So the fact that I only found one item above 10 is for me a good sign. So remember, it's not only about doing the analysis and reporting, it's about these checks that we do along the path. And I had to have a look at all of these with high values, and I need to ask myself, but do I need to remove the item statistically? But now you're also confirming it makes sense, but let's keep it in for now. So if we lose it later on, you know where it's coming from.
In an extreme case, there's something wrong with the data, because we had one of our PhD students, and was a big, he just said, okay, I'm not going to, he just said that if you look at that value, all of them, it's very high, so I cannot do factor analysis, that's it. And then he just reported on all 40 items individually. So, well, I basically said there's something wrong with your data of your questionnaire. So if you get something like that, because you didn't test the questionnaire, or you didn't do your fieldwork properly, we just get that, what do? Can you solve it?
It's a big problem. I had 2 students that were referred back, one in health sciences, where the examiners became aware of issues, because if you get some, I don't want to say clever, but you get some savvy researchers that know their data, you quickly become aware that it's a data collection issue. So it's a quality of data. I'm currently sitting with one.
Instrument issue or something. Instrument that they've compiled themselves.
Now they go back to that philosophy of the epistemology. So what processes did you follow to make sure? I'm currently sitting with a student that did research in the DRC on tourism. I'm telling you, it's got nothing to do with the statistical analysis, nothing. It's about her data. Things that should make sense on a correlation perspective to that theory-driven. There should be a positive. We don't find any correlation. I find it's as if someone sat under a tree and completed the questionnaire. So the field work is an issue. Now the supervisor is starting to ask questions about the quality of the data, because it becomes so obvious through these things that there's no variation, or there's people just say, I disagree, I disagree, I disagree. The number of standard deviations that come out with low standard deviations, and it doesn't make sense.
And I think you might get it on a panel level, where you get all these people that complete questionnaires for the wrong reasons. They just agree, and there's no quality in if you just buy a panel anyway.
So it happens. So this is what we call, Pauline, we've spoken about it. This is your common method bias. Because now more people are starting, and with COVID, it's a problem, because all the people that were supposed to do research through hard copies, hand-out questionnaires, had to revert to online questionnaires. And they struggle to get people. So now they ask their friends to complete it. And they don't explain to them, you cannot sit, and just say, I agree, I agree. You must actually think about the questions. And in thinking about the items, it must be that you should be a relevant member of the population where this theory applies. You can't outthink correlation. And I see more of these coming back to me, which being referred by our college to say something is wrong with the data. So it's an ethics issue. You need to be very careful, but this is in support of all of the things that were said about the data, the fieldwork elements, the rigor, the supervision, the checking of the data. We can't tell someone, listen, you are now just agreeing with everyone. That's not good fieldwork. You must let it carry on, because if he says that's his answers, that's confidentiality. But later on, you must ask yourself, but are there processes that we can put in place? This person just said, I agree, straight through. Is that the expectancy of the scales that we are using? So do we expect everyone to just agree with the independent variables and the dependent? The worst case scenario is that person must go back and redo their data collection. And that's because they don't have money, but we've got no other choice.
Sure, that's a major problem.
I mean, it's a major problem. And they did not tell us. I'm even finding, if I look at we picked it up. It's about coastal research that's being supposed to be done. If you go and look at the map of DRC, there's a very small stretch of beach, about 30 kilometers for tourism. She did some of these research inland at a river and did not, in the questionnaires, it says that this is the location. So when we go and have a look at the map, the research was done inland. So all of these things suddenly the evidence in the data start to show that there's a quality